It's clearly my honour and privilege to be in the chair for at least the opening of this particular debate. So we now come to the backbench debate on World AIDS Day, and I call Lloyd Russell Moyle to move.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I must declare an interest, of course, as the Vice Chair of the APPG for HIV AIDS and honorary patron of the British HIV Association, and of course personally affected by these issues. Before I start the debate, I'd like to thank the Backbench Business Committee for granting this debate to mark World AIDS Day, because of course every year on the 1st of December, today, the world commemorates World AIDS Day. People from around the world unite to show support for people living with and affected by HIV and remember those who lost their lives to AIDS. At 5:30 tonight, I, among the community in Brighton, will, as we do every year, read out the names of all the people that died of AIDS in the last 40 years since the first death in Brighton, and vigils like that will be happening up and down the country, in London, in Birmingham, in Manchester, in Oxford, and others. This year's theme is Equalise. It is a recognition of the health inequalities that still affect far too many children, men that sleep with men, transgender, drug users, sex workers, and people in prison. Those are the most affected populations by HIV and AIDS in their respective countries. Different countries might have different and more focused populations, but those are the groups. But fundamentally, the groups that are most at risk are people who are marginalised from healthcare. And that's what we need to equalise, that's what we need to sort out. This year marks the 40th anniversary since the death of the former Hansard reporter, Terry Higgins, who died of an AIDS-related illness on the 4th of July 1982, and the creation, of course, of the now well-known Terence Higgins Trust. Of course, on behalf of the APPG, I'd like to thank them for the work that not only they have done over the last 40 years, but the work that they keep doing in pushing that we have no new transmissions of HIV by 2030. That seems a remarkable target, but it is in our fingers. And of course, it will help an estimated 106,000 people living with HIV in England that we know of. Their work, the Terence Higgins Trust, along with the National AIDS Trust and others, continues to lead the way, and I'm delighted that the two organisations are working closer together, and I hope that collaboration continues. Ahead of World AIDS Day in 2018, 4 years ago now, I spoke in this chamber about my own diagnosis. I said then that World AIDS Day is deeply personal to me because next year I will be marking an anniversary of my own. Now, of course, it's 14 years since I became HIV positive. It's been a long journey from fear to acceptance to today, where I now play a role of advocacy, knowing that my treatment keeps me healthy and protects any partner that I might have, preventing me from passing on the disease. Since then, further developments have happened in the fight of HIV/AIDS. Many positive, but there are some setbacks, which I wish to talk about in a bit. We have, of course, a HIV action plan in England, setting clear goals and milestones to achieving this target, and similar plans are set to be launched in Scotland and Wales. We hope that they will come quickly. Last year's HIV Action Plan for England sets out how we will achieve an 80% reduction in HIV infections by 2025, building to the end of transmissions by 2030. This plan will, 1, prevent new infections by expanding and improving HIV prevention activities, investing £3.5 million in a national HIV prevention programme up to 2024, and ensure PrEP is expanded to all key groups. 2, it will scale up HIV testing in high-risk populations where uptake is low and ensure new infections are identified rapidly, including the expanding of opt-out testing in A&E departments in areas of very high prevalence of HIV, and will be backed by 20 million over the next 3 years. And 3, it will ensure, once diagnosed, people rapidly receive treatment as we know it. When I was first diagnosed, you waited until your CD4 count was below 200. Below 200 is when you can start to get infections and AIDS can start to be diagnosed. Because at that time, we didn't know whether the drugs would cause continuing side effects. Now, we are in a situation where as soon as you are diagnosed, you go on the drugs because we know that they have very little side effects. You have to, of course, get the right combination for each person because everyone reacts, but we have a good number of array of drugs to do that. And it means that very quickly, within a matter of months, those people, new people who are diagnosed, can be undetectable and can effectively go about their life without fear or favour. And that is a remarkable change in those 14 years.
We're done with some giveaway on that.
I will do, yes.
The Honourable Gentleman, I congratulate him and commend him for his stance and his leadership in this House and indeed outside of this House when it comes to HIV, AIDS and how to live with it and how he has done that. In Northern Ireland, which the Honourable Gentleman didn't refer to, but just to add it to the because I think it's the Public Health Agency in Northern Ireland are responsible for it. They hope and their ambition is to ensure that they will reach the target of in 2030 to eliminate HIV transmission. They seem confident they can do that because of the preparation that the Honourable Gentleman referred to. It's just it's good sometimes to mark and record things that are going well.
It is remarkable, and if we achieve this 2030 target in this country, and this is a lot of ifs, and if we then achieve to roll that out globally, it would be the first disease that we have rolled back via treatment and prevention rather than via vaccine. And so it would be a world leader and hopefully a pioneer in how we can treat and test other diseases, particularly with mass testing, which I will come on to in a second. If all this happens, we will meet the 2030 target, but the government needs to, of course, do more. We always say that, don't we? To start with, the government needs to expand opt-out testing. It has been trialled now in what's called very high prevalence areas. That is Brighton, London, Manchester and Blackpool. In fact, not all of London was originally included in the opt-out testing, but London took the decision to expand it to all hospitals in London, sharing out the money. What that has shown, remarkably, is in non-high prevalence areas, the percentage of people coming back with a HIV positive test is still significant, and therefore the argument now is to roll this out to all areas. Over the past 12 months, we've seen real successes in the opt-out testing in England. This is where you already are having your bloods taken in A&E, and they just send the vial off additionally to get another test. We are testing for HIV and hepatitis B, unless they opt out. Of course, no one is forced. Very few people, I think, actually do opt out, my understanding is. And the results of the pilot have been quite astonishing. In just 3 months, 102 people were newly identified, and 70 people were identified as dropping out of treatment. And of course, if you drop out of treatment, you're not only a risk to yourself, you are a risk to the wider community. And those people have now been brought back into treatment and have saved lives. The results are clear. Opt-out testing is working. On a side note, I would say it is possible with the same vial to also test for syphilis. But it wasn't possible to expand to syphilis because syphilis testing is paid for by local authorities, not by NHS England. And the local authorities were unable to identify where the people were from because hospitals are not coterminous with local authorities and it was too complicated. This seems ridiculous to me, and we need the government to sit down with local authorities or just provide that through central funding. If we're taking the vial, we can run it through the same machine, but the only reason we're stopping is because of a bureaucratic reason. I don't see why we can't. We should be testing routinely people for as many things as we can if we know it will help people's lives. And we know that there is a spike in syphilis in certain key populations as well. This vital programme, if eventually expanded to all towns and cities with high prevalence, will be a game changer. And where London has expanded the programme, as I said, it has been financially already worthwhile in the areas of non-very high prevalence. This programme should also be expanded to sexual health clinics to ensure everyone going to a sexual health clinic is tested for HIV. It might be a surprise to many, but it is not always routinely done, and it is not an opt-out. And actually it's becoming less common, not more common, for a HIV test, because more sexual health clinics are moving to online services. There's some really great advantages to online services, but one of the downsides is that it requires people to collect a vial of their own blood, which often doesn't happen or doesn't happen effectively, and so therefore the HIV test rates are lower. And so we do need to ensure that when people attend a clinic, it is routine and opt out there. Some clinics do it already, but it is not universal. I spoke about HIV prevention drug PrEP back in 2018. We have come a long way since the PrEP impact trial. PrEP, to remind colleagues, is a pill you can take daily. It contains 2 of the 3 drugs that someone with HIV would have. In fact, I've now been reduced down to 2 because the latest evidence shows that once you get to undetectable, you can reduce the drug load for people who have HIV to effectively just the PrEP load as well. It's not exactly the same drugs that I take for PrEP, but some people will do, and they can maintain on that as well. So this is also new interventions that we're able to reduce the costs and the amount of drugs we're putting in. But PrEP prevents HIV, and it is covered by, the pill is covered by NHS England, but thousands are still missing out because they're struggling to get PrEP appointments because of the under-resourced sexual health services. This is laid bare in the latest National AIDS Trust, Terence Higgins Trust, Prepster, Sophia Forum and One Voice Network report. It is due to the fragmentation of services in England. The drug PrEP is paid for by the NHS England, and this is a real milestone from the NHS, and I congratulate the government for getting this out eventually after our interventions. But anyone who is currently sexually active should be tested by sexual health services every 3 months. Anyone on PrEP should be tested every 3 months. In theory, there is no additional resource, therefore, for sexual health services for someone on PrEP, because the only people on PrEP should be people who are sexually active. We shouldn't be giving it to people who don't need it, or drug-injecting users who should also be tested, etc. But our sexual health services in this country rely on balancing the budget by the fact that people don't attend as regularly as they should do, and are so therefore limiting the places for PrEP appointments and limiting the people who can get access to a drug that the NHS is paying for, even though they're entitled to it, and even though they should be offering that level of service. Awareness is far too low of PrEP, and it cannot be given out by GPs, pharmacies, community or maternity services. So this means that the burden is solely on local government-funded sexual health services. And I think we all know what's happening with local government. We probably don't need to go there in this. That's a whole other debate. If we're going to meet our 2030 target, it is vital that everyone who is at risk of acquiring HIV and wishes to can access PrEP as a key tool to completely and effectively preventing new HIV transmissions when it is taken as directed. Over the past 2 years, the APPG on HIV/AIDS has published 3 important reports. We published increasing and normalising HIV testing across the UK, something I've just touched on. We published Nothing About Us Without Us, addressing the needs of Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities in the UK, the community currently one of the hardest hit by HIV in this country, and also the community least likely to have HIV testing done routinely. What I would say is the rollout and trial of the saliva HIV testing that Terence Higgins Trust did 2 years ago and last year was particularly effective in those communities. It was seen as less invasive, more private and easier to get hold of and possible to do via online and postal services. The government should consider whether that should be a process that is normalised nationally or provided cheaply and accessibly. The other report that we did was HIV and Quality Life. What do we mean? How do we achieve it? That has launched today, and my colleagues have been launching that in Brussels with our partners in Europe. These reports have only been made possible by the evidence provided by the strong HIV sector we have in the UK. Their continued insights and hard work is, of course, appreciated. The latest data, however, is not quite as positive. 2,629 people diagnosed across England in 2021. That is up 0.7% from 2,673 in 2020. A small amount, you might say. But in 2022, there was a fall of 0.2%, and in 2019, there was a fall of 33%. We are clearly plateauing, and there's a danger that we are starting to get more diagnosis. Now, this might be positive because we are delving down to the hardest reach areas, but we need to have more evidence on why we've plateaued and why that is creeping up before we can be sure that it is something to celebrate rather than something to be worried about. In order to keep on track, it is vital that we use every lever available to end HIV transmission and ensure that we do not plateau, as the numbers are showing. As I've said, we can end transmission by 2030, and I strongly believe that the UK will be one of the first countries to do so. We are a world leader. I spoke to our London NHS colleagues at the beginning of this week, and they said it is the first time in their career that they have had people phoning up from around the world saying, how are you doing the opt-out testing? How are you doing the PrEP rollout? We want to learn from you. This is remarkable, and this is something to be deeply proud of. When I brought the head of UN AIDS came to London and Brighton, and we showed her around, we showed her the HIV testing vending machines we have in Brighton, she said, I thought I would never learn anything for the developing world from a rich country. I was here as a courtesy visit, but I've seen what you are doing and how we could roll that out to parts in Kenya, we could roll it out to Uganda, we can roll these out to community settings around the world. Solar panelled, run HIV testing vending machines. I will give way.
Thank you, Honourable Member, for giving me, congratulate him for all the work that he does on this issue. But that global leadership is incredibly important. And so does he share the disappointment, and he might be coming on to this, that a lot of people in this sector and the wider international development sector, and perhaps even the head of UN AIDS, share at the cut in the UK government's funding to the Global Fund to tackle HIV, AIDS and other communicable diseases, because it does risk exactly the kind of backsliding that he's warning of.
I exactly agree. I will come on to, at the very end, I will come on about the Global Fund, but I am now to move on to the global section of the speech. The global picture, I'm afraid, is totally different, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Back in 2018, I said one young person every day still diagnosed with HIV, and young people continue to suffer some of the worst sexual health outcomes. The situation has become bleaker globally. Last year, every 2 minutes, an adolescent girl or young woman was newly affected with HIV. Every 2 minutes. In the last year alone, 650,000 people died of AIDS-related illnesses, and 1.5 million people became affected with HIV. Only half of children living with HIV have access to life-saving medication, and inequality in HIV treatment coverage between children and adults is increasing rather than narrowing. So why are people dying still unnecessarily of AIDS, and why are there so many new HIV infections year after year globally? It is too easy to put the blame on current crises that we are facing, COVID, war, etc. But the reality is we were already off target in much of this before many of these crises hit. Comprehensive healthcare systems, lack of education, and the growing influence of evangelical Christian, often American-backed churches in Africa have led to an environment that is hostile to the effective HIV response. In Uganda, they were the first country to host the World AIDS Summit. They were a revolutionary leader, the same president in power now, but has completely rolled back. When they hosted the World AIDS Conference almost 30 years ago, condoms were given to every delegate, they were given out into community settings. When I visited Uganda to visit aid projects that we were paying for, only a few years ago. I was sitting in the back of a classroom with Stephen Twigg, my colleague who was chair of the IDC at the time, and we were listening to a teacher telling the children that they could prevent AIDS if they washed the toilet seats and if they observed sex only after marriage. I'm afraid the situation has gone backwards because of the influence of some of these malign groups, and it is concerning. One of the inequalities standing in the way of AIDS is also inequality of access to education, particularly for young girls. 6 in 7 new HIV infections among adolescents in sub-Saharan Africa are occurring among girls outside formal education. Enabling girls to stay in school until they complete secondary school reduces their vulnerability to HIV by over 50%. All children, including both those who drop out because of COVID and those who are out of school anyway, should get a complete secondary school education, including comprehensive sex education. Yet, as countries struggle, I will do.
For giving way, and he makes such an important point. Would he agree with me that we cannot shy away from talking about sexual and reproductive health in the developing world, because that is the single most effective way to make sure that girls stay in school, that they stay not pregnant, and in the case of this debate, that they stay free from diseases that would affect them going forward. And it's absolutely crucial that our role as providers of international aid does not step back from programmes which talk about contraception.
I totally agree, and we have a greater responsibility as, I'm afraid, the dark forces around the world come and try and withdraw money from programmes that might talk rationally and evidence-based around sex and reproductive rights. We must step up, because if it is not us, others will not do it, I'm afraid. And so it is important we do this. And it is a double-edged coin, as the Honourable Lady quite rightly points out. You provide better sexual health education, and girls stay in school, and girls staying in school allows them to get better education around their health. Both is a positive thing, but both need to be tackled together. Another inequality that stands in the way of ending AIDS is the inequality in the realisation of human rights. Some 68 countries still criminalise gay men. Laws which punish same-sex relation, in addition to contravening the human rights of LGBT+ people, help sustain the stigma and discrimination against people. Such laws are barriers to people seeking and receiving healthcare for fear of being punished or detained. The repeal of such laws worldwide is vital in helping the task against AIDS. 36 of those 68 countries that outlaw homosexuality are Commonwealth countries. The majority of the Commonwealth still upholding colonial laws that we imposed never originated in their own countries in the first place. In fact, before British colonialism, or I should say British imperialism, many of those countries had better customs and practices around homosexuality than they do now. These customs and practices are not native to their home countries. They were imposed, and they should be discarded with the shackles of imperialism that we all now recognise was wrong. 1 in 4 men in Caribbean countries where homosexuality is criminalised have HIV, and 60% of people globally living with HIV live in Commonwealth countries. This is a responsibility that we have to tackle in the Commonwealth collectively. These barriers undermine the right to health, a right which all people should enjoy. And beyond human rights implications, the law criminalising homosexuality also has an impact on public health. LGBT+ people end up not seeking health services for fear of being prosecuted, and those that do often have to lie about how they were infected. It is widely believed that the astronomically high numbers of those with HIV in Russia who say they were infected because they were drug-injecting users is partly because the attitudes in Russia is it is better to be a drug-injecting user than an LGBTQ person. But without accurately knowing where people are being infected from, We cannot accurately run public health programmes to save those people. Putting people undercover, in the dark, hidden in corners, means that the virus lives on. And that is the danger for all of us. In some countries, people living with HIV are at risk of being criminalised even when they take precautions with their sexual partners. This opens them up to blackmail and fraudulent claims from former partners. And people with HIV in the UK are not immune to this either, as we've seen with some high-profile cases. For at least 20 years, we have known that antiviral therapy reduces HIV transmissions, but for the last few years, of course, as I've mentioned, we know that it stops it completely. There should be no doubt that a person with sustained undetectable levels of HIV in their blood cannot transmit HIV to their sexual partner, and laws shouldn't punish that. But, for example, under the Canadian criminal law, people living with HIV can be charged and prosecuted if they do not inform their partner about their HIV-positive status before having sex. The law does not follow the science, and it puts people at risk. Laws requiring disclosure further perpetrate stigma against HIV people. Now, with the advent of PrEP and with undetectable means untransmittable, the law should reflect that everyone has a role in protecting themselves against HIV, and everyone must step up. The criminalisation of drug injecting users and sex workers has an equally negative effect on HIV prevention and treatment, as I've already outlined in the LGBT communities. In all these areas, a health and human rights-based approach must be one that is taken if we truly want to see the end of HIV. Beating pandemics is a political challenge. We can end HIV and AIDS by 2030 in this country, but only if we are bold in the actions and our investments. We need courageous leadership. We need people worldwide to insist that their leaders are courageous. And that's why last month it was so disappointing not to see that courageous leadership from this government. The government were the only donor in the Global Fund against HIV, malaria and TB to cut its financial settlement. A cut of £400 million. The Global Fund asked donors to contribute a rise in pledges by 30% this year. Almost all the G7 nations who are suffering similar economic problems in many respects to us, as we're often reminded from the government, this is a global crisis, not a crisis of the government's making. I mean, our view is it's a bit of both, but they increased their amounts. For decades, the UK was the leader in the global response to these infections and diseases, but no more. When our other allies met the global funds for 30% increase, the UK went for a 30% cut from their 2019 pledge. I will do.
Well, gentlemen, for giving way, and my friend for giving this speech, because he is an extraordinary advocate in this area. But actually what I do want to do is just make the point and put it on record, which is that the UK is the third biggest funder of the Global Fund. We have to date contributed just over or just under £4.5 billion. And the point that he has made in his speech about how we are leading the way in terms of our health and our treatment and that other countries are following, that too is a commodity that can be traded, to be given to other countries. So it's not always about the value of the money that we give, but the skills, the research, the development that we can trade as well. I just think we have to be clear about this, and he knows where I stand on the development point, but I think it's worth making that point.
He's been very good on the development issues in the past, and I think he's right. But what then he touches upon is the discussion about patents and patent waivers. And there is a real live discussion around how we ensure that the poorest countries in the world are able to access some of the frontline drugs. Long-lasting drugs is some of the latest innovations where you would be able to either inject or give a set of implants, effectively. I can't think what the word is off the top of my head, where it would give them the drugs for up to a month and a half. Now, this is really rather revolutionary, particularly if you have irregular access to health systems. So you would only be needed to be visited on an irregular basis. The problem is that those are the most expensive form of drugs because of the way that our patent system works, but they're the most useful in the hardest to reach areas of the world, compared to in the UK, where most people have regular access to medical settings and can receive daily pill medication. Now, the UK has not always been the very best in seeking patent waivers. We have with many HIV drugs, but we should be looking at doing that more widely, and that might be a good compromise, but then we need to step up on that line as well. This is a disastrous decision in my view, and it stems from the 0.5 cap that the Conservatives have put on international development. Rather than it being a flaw and saying that that is the bottom of our ambition, the government has said it is the top of our ambition. And of course their insistence of including the Ukraine scheme, where we are housing people here in the UK, in that 0.5 cap, means that money is flowing out of the International Development Department. International development, internationally spent money, should be at 0.5, and then we will be able to fulfil lots of these commitments quite easily. And then, of course, additional support and aid and charity that we are doing should be celebrated, but it should not be at the detriment of others. This cut will represent a preventable death of 1.5 million people and risk over 34.5 million new transmissions across HIV, TB and malaria together. It will no doubt harm our credibility, and I do hope that we're able to reverse it as soon as we can. Okay. Along with my other colleagues in the HIV, AIDS, APPG, we have the political will to meet these targets set by the UN AIDS and the targets by the action plans in Wales, Scotland, England, and I'm pleased to hear in Northern Ireland. We will continue our APPG to work and challenge the government on ensuring that we do the same. But it is time that we step up and push for that final mile. When you are at the end of the race, you don't slow down, you speed up. This is a prize that we can win. Let's not let it slip through the hands. In the words of the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, let us end dither and delay. Let us end HIV AIDS today. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
The question is, as on the order paper, Caroline Noakes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it is a real pleasure to follow the honourable gentleman from Brighton, Kemp Town, who speaks with such passion, knowledge and indeed experience. And I vividly remember being in this chamber 4 years ago now, when he spoke of his own diagnosis and how he had coped with it, the emotional stress and trauma, the physical challenges, and of course, it is always a real privilege to follow anyone in this House who speaks with such a depth of knowledge. I apologise for focusing my comments today almost exclusively, however, on women. As Chair of the Women and Equalities Select Committee, I am very conscious that some of the people whose diagnoses are made latest, some of the people who are afraid of going for a test, are indeed women. And it's always, in my role as chair of the committee, been incredibly humbling to meet those women living with HIV who have spoken of the barriers that they felt that there were for them going to get a test, which is why I absolutely commend the work done by organisations like the Terence Higgins Trust and indeed the APPG in this place, which has always led the way in trying to break down the stigma associated with testing. Now, there really should be no stigma associated with testing. There was no stigma, Madam Deputy Speaker, over the course of the last 2 years in going to get your COVID test. And actually going and making yourself aware of your own HIV status is one of the most empowering things that an individual can do. And it's why, as chair of the Select Committee, and indeed before that, I've never been afraid. Now, that's the wrong term to use. I've always been keen to make sure that I use my role to emphasise to others that it is perfectly okay to go and get a test, and indeed it is a lot easier nowadays to get a test than it used to be. Now, I say I've never been afraid, but I vividly remember the Honourable Gentleman's predecessor, Simon Kirby, the MP for Brighton Kemp Town, used to arrange every year, annually in this place, a testing session for MPs. And I can remember Simon telling me years ago, Noakesy, you have to go along and get a test. And sort of looking at him, rolling my eyes and saying, I don't really fancy that, I don't really want to go. I think, I'm slightly terrified at the prospect of going. But actually, coming out of that test and thinking that was the right thing to do, I now know I don't have HIV, therefore I can relax about that, but I also know the importance of talking about it. I also remember the grief on social media from the ill-educated and ignorant and, to be quite frank, bigoted, who used that as a stick with which to beat me. Oh, why did she need an HIV test? Well, why did I need one? One, to know, but secondly, to use that voice to everybody else who felt anxious about going and getting an HIV test, say there is nothing wrong with it, there is no stigma attached to it, you're doing it for your own well-being. Which is why I now act as a champion for all women, telling them of the importance to go and get a test done. And the Honourable Gentleman made a really important point, and I dwelt on this a little bit when thinking about the comments that I wanted to make today, which is about the prevalence of online or postal testing. Now, look, I think they're a great innovation, but I also remember, I think it was earlier this year actually, receiving the little package through the post, give HIV the finger, a wonderful message, but how hard it was to get the required amount of blood out of my finger, and then having slight concern as to, is that enough? Will this be effective? Who knows? Now, for me, much of that process was about holding up the box, being photographed proudly, having taken an HIV test. But the second part of that is we need these testing programs to be effective. We need people to be confident to use them, and we need them to be available in all sorts of locations, which brings me on to my second point. We need them to be culturally competent and aware. And it's really interesting, the statistics that we look at, that we know a third of those people living with HIV are women. We know that 25% of the new diagnoses are in women, but we also know of the prevalence in Black African communities. And we learnt through COVID, and I am an absolute advocate, that you have to learn the lessons of really difficult experiences. We learnt through COVID the importance of speaking to people in languages that they understand, in a way they can relate to, on the media channels that they instinctively use. It is no good to broadcast your public health messages exclusively on the BBC. You have to find different channels in order to communicate with the audiences who are most at risk, where the prevalence is highest, and where they might not be engaging with the traditional forms of media that you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I might use. So I think that's a really important message that I would like to give to NHS England and to the DHSC. We must keep up the pressure to be talking to those communities where there is high prevalence and where there might be barriers, cultural or otherwise, to going and getting a test. Another point that I wanted to make that I do think is important, and it is relevant more widely as well, is that of research. Now look, it's absolutely crucial that a great deal of the research into HIV and AIDS is done on those people who are most likely to be affected. So, of course, a massive wealth of the research has been done on men. I absolutely acknowledge that is the right thing to do, but there are knowledge gaps when it comes to women with HIV. There are knowledge gaps when it comes to which drugs might be most effective for them, and there is certainly still a barrier which can be borne out in the numbers of women accessing PrEP. They're simply not using it. And so we have to understand both why that is, how effective that drug, and indeed other HIV drugs, may be on women. And we have to make sure that the DHSC and NHS England are able to not only have sufficient data, but to disaggregate that data so that it breaks it down by both gender and indeed ethnicity. And in so much in health, Madam Deputy Speaker, I find myself complaining and browbeating on the subject of data that is relevant exclusively to women, about the lack of women coming forward for drug trials, about the lack of research that is done on women, and the same is true when it comes to HIV. What we have been good at, and if you read the action plan for HIV, it talks about the successes in vertical transmission, the tiny number of children that are now born in this country with HIV. Now look, a big part of that is down to opt-out testing of pregnant women, where the take-up has been absolutely enormous, and it has resulted, I think, in the figures show that in 2019, of the 60 children with AIDS born in that year, only 5 of them were born in the UK. Look, that's a huge step forward, and we have done brilliantly in vertical transmission. But it is still crucially important that we never let up on that we get the message out there that effective drugs taken during pregnancy can prevent HIV transmission to a baby, that you have to be mindful as to the method of birth, whether that be natural delivery or via caesarean, and that also there is a risk factor involved in breastfeeding. But all of these pieces of information can effectively and easily be communicated to expectant mothers, and they absolutely should and must be. I am very conscious, speaking today, that my level of knowledge is not as great as that of other members in the Chamber, so I've kept my comments deliberately relatively brief. But I do think that we need to keep up the pressure. The Honourable Gentleman opposite said, and normally when I'm involved in anything that involves running, there's definitely a slowdown as I approach the finish line, usually through exhaustion. We cannot afford to do that here. We must accelerate to the finish. We can now see a world, a UK without HIV, and he made some very, very important points about the developing world and the efforts that still need to be made there. But we can see the end in sight, and it's absolutely crucial that we make sure that we reach it and see a world that is free of HIV.
Jim Shannon.
Mr. Speaker, can I say what a pleasure it is to speak in this debate, and what it is a pleasure to follow the Honourable Lady. She and I in this House, and indeed in Westminster Hall, seem to be on the same side on many occasions, and I commend her for the work that she does in promoting the values and the aspirations and the concerns of women across in this House, in this country, but indeed across the world. I can also commend the Honourable Gentleman for setting the scene so very well. And I don't think I've ever missed a debate on HIV/AIDS in this House or in Westminster Hall, so I wanted to come along and add a contribution, and also to support him, commend him, as I've said before in my intervention. But he has been a shining light, I believe, to many of those who suffer from AIDS across this whole United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And the Honourable Gentleman has done that today in an exceptional way, and well done to him. World AIDS Day, as the Honourable Gentleman said, in his contribution at the beginning, he referred to that this will be the theme, the global theme for World AIDS Day is to equalise. And I thought to myself, that's exactly what we should be trying to do. Make sure that everyone in this great United Kingdom has the access to the PrEP drugs that he referred to, and I will speak to very, very shortly. But also the same opportunity, the same access, the same opportunity to have that medication and that treatment should be available across the world. The Honourable Gentleman outlined that so very well, and I fully support that. So what we do here, let's replicate that across the world as well. The World AIDS Day, they've set 4 actions. First one was to increase availability, quality and suitability of services for HIV treatment, testing and prevention, so that everyone is well served. Secondly, to reform the laws, policies and practices to tackle the stigma and exclusion faced by people living with HIV and by key and marginalised populations, so that everyone is shown respect and is welcomed. And the Honourable Gentleman did that very well. Ensure the sharing of technology to enable equal access to the best HIV science between communities between the global south and the north. Communities, lastly, will be able to make use of and adapt the equalised message to highlight the particular inequalities they face and to press for the actions needed to address them. Stop AIDS have been in contact with my office ahead of this debate. They have informed me that the UK, which has provided some 15 million a year for the last 5 years, has cut its funding by more than 80% to just 2.5 million this year. I know it's not the Minister's responsibility, but really I have to concur with the Honourable Gentleman here. There's just a debate that would be my concern as well. I think that concern will be expressed by others in this chamber, and perhaps the Minister can, even though he doesn't have direct responsibility for it. I suspect that maybe we could have an answer to that. The proposed UN AIDS cuts risk jeopardising work supporting some of the most marginalised people. So I would request that the government here and our minister should uplift our funding even just slightly to ensure charitable organisations are fully funded to do their work. I mentioned in an intervention to the Honourable Gentleman, and I want to quote it if I can, because I think it outlines what we're doing in Northern Ireland through the Public Health Agency. And the achievements that have been achieved, even though there may have been a slight increase in the numbers of those with HIV, but it's how you combat that, and I think what they've done is excellent. The 22 report, which the Public Health Agency published an annual surveillance report on sexually transmitted infections, the 2022 report, based on the 21 data, showed that there were 76 new cases of HIV were diagnosed in Northern Ireland in 2021, a 12% increase from 68 in 2020. But also, here's the key, but also that more HIV testing was being done. Almost 80,000 HIV tests were carried out in Northern Ireland during 2021, a 21% increase from the 66,000 approximately in 2020. The PHA said it's making a great progress towards eliminating HIV transmission by 2030, adding that frequent HIV testing, the offer of PrEP to those most at risk of HIV, together with the prompt treatment among those diagnosed, remains key to achieving this. So more testing, more contact, less numbers of those getting AIDS. There's an example of what we're doing in Northern Ireland, and I think it's something that should be commended. So I commend the Public Health Agency for doing that, and for doing that so very well. In 2019 in Northern Ireland, 40% of new HIV diagnoses were gay and bisexual men. In comparison, 52% were from the heterosexual contact. There is a stereotype and the assumption that all people with HIV or AIDS are gay or bisexual. Those stats disputes that very clearly. The Honourable Lady for Romsey and Southampton South referred to something that's the same thing in Northern Ireland as well, by the way. And when it comes to there must be greater awareness of the fact that it's not only gay men who get AIDS. In fact, it's impacting the lives of many women too. And many of those 52% in Northern Ireland, unfortunately, are ladies. The Honourable Lady has outlined that case so exceptionally well. I think it's good we have it on record that this disease is something that we need to have tackling head on in all ways. The HIV strategy must reflect that more heterosexual people get HIV than those who are gay or bisexual. A new strategy is clearly needed, one that encompasses the figures that we have and helps us understand those issues even better than what we do at this moment. I want to also, if I can, mention the Honourable Gentleman referred to, it's not a criticism, by the way, to the Honourable Gentleman who introduced the debate, but just to give an example. In my constituency of Strangford, I have a very, very active church. It's the Elim Church in Newtownards. They've had an incredible strategy for Swaziland in South Africa. They've helped them build their hospitals, their health clinics, their education, their schools, their buildings, providing jobs. But you know what they've also done? They've actually physically helped address the AIDS epidemic that there was in Swaziland. And those are things that need to be done in a very, very proactive and positive way. But I commend the Elim Church and Elim Missions in Newtownards as an example of what can be done if the will and the understanding is there. And I think they have done that in such a way that, not by their own efforts alone, Madam Deputy Speaker, but the efforts of others collectively together to reduce the numbers of people in Swaziland who have AIDS. They've also got another one, I want to mention this as well, it's very important. There are many orphans in Swaziland whose parents have died due to AIDS, and some of those children were babies born with AIDS. So they've got it through no fault of their own, their children, if I can use that terminology, and they actively work with them as well. They come every year to my constituency as part of the missionary work that the church does, and can't fail ever to be moved by their singing and their joy that they have, even though they have, but they're getting some of that treatment and medication as well. So I put that on record. I want also, very quickly, Mr. Chairman, Madam Deputy Speaker, I don't tend to speak very long. Northern Ireland only has one HIV charity, Positive Life. I want to commend them and say how well they do for us in Northern Ireland. They attend our party conference every year. I make it a business to speak to them every year and thank them for all they do, because they do tremendous work to promote a positive future for people living with or affected by HIV in Northern Ireland. They provide the rabbit-free testing for those who are concerned that they may have HIV, and they offer support along the way. So we're all indebted to the charities, and in this case Positive Life in Northern Ireland, but all the other charities as well that we have are playing an invaluable role in battling HIV and making stereotypes and stigma a thing of the past. For those in Northern Ireland who have AIDS, whether it be through transfusions, whether it be through activities or whatever it may be, we have a clear strategy through the Public Health Agency. I'm very pleased to be able to say, Madam Deputy Speaker, today in this House, that encourages me and gives me great hope that we have positivity, not just in Northern Ireland, but the Honourable Gentleman is an example of the positivity. And I think I commend him and I commend the Minister and for his. I'm anticipating your answers, Minister, so I'm hoping the answers will be along the lines that we're thinking of. But just to say thank you so much.
Nicola Richards.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Honourable Member for Brighton Kemp Town for leading this debate and his commitment to this cause. As the number of new cases of HIV falls in this country, the importance of this issue does not. We stand on the shoulder of giants, and the 38 million globally lost to AIDS-related illness. Their early passing will not be forgotten. In fact, it inspires us to work harder and quicker. This government is proud to be one of the first in the world to commit to ending new HIV cases by 2030, and proud to put our money where our mouth is. This time last year, my honourable friend, the member for Bromsgrove, as Health Secretary, provided £20 million to fund opt-out testing in London, Brighton and Manchester. Thanks to the campaigns of the Terence Higgins Trust and my honourable friend, the member for Blackpool South, and his city was rightfully included. This investment has had remarkable results and is already garnering savings for the NHS. In the first 100 days of this programme, around 128 people were newly diagnosed and 65 people roughly were previously diagnosed and returned to the care of a HIV clinic. On top of all the standard HIV testing, that is almost 200 people no longer have an HIV attack at their immune system and who cannot pass on the virus to others. What a triumph. When you add in that half the hospitals also tested for hepatitis and found 325 with Hep B and 153 with Hep C, the success only builds. Well over 500 people have been stopped from getting very unwell on our watch. Having spent about £2.2 million of funding on 4 months of this testing, the savings are calculated at between £6 and £8 million. These are not pipe dream savings, but a real reduction to the pressures on A&E and hospitals that they are facing this winter. At Croydon Hospital, when they first started opt-out testing, the average hospital stay for newly diagnosed HIV patients was 34.9 days. 2 years later, it's 2.4 days. And I know a few hospitals that could do with that pressure being released for them too. Madam Deputy Speaker, in the West Midlands, we have 5 areas of high HIV prevalence. My own borough of Sandwell is among them, with a prevalence rate of 2.92 per 1,000 adults, well above the national average. The National Institute for Health and Care Excellence say that areas like Sandwell should be, I quote, offered and recommend HIV testing on admission to hospital, including emergency departments, to everyone who has not previously been diagnosed with HIV and who is undergoing blood tests for another reason. But it is not yet happening in Wolverhampton, Coventry, Sandwell, Birmingham or Walsall. We have to find our undiagnosed and lost care residents and get them into treatment ASAP. The Mayor of the West Midlands, Andy Street, has written to the Health Secretary asking for this Invest to Save resource for our region. Can I add my voice to this call and ask my honourable friend if he can help level up the HIV response outside of London, and with funding for opt-out HIV testing, we can put the West Midlands on track for ending new HIV cases by 2030. Andy Street rightly said that this is not a World AIDS Day stunt, but a serious call for action. It is not just good enough to wear a ribbon, it needs to be a reminder that HIV is still happening to many people. I know my honourable friend, the member for Birmingham Northfield, as well as locally elected members in Sandwell like Councillor Scott Chapman, joined me and Andy in asking for an extension in opt-out testing that would cover my constituency of West Bromwich East. We've made such incredible strides, as well as remembering the devastation HIV has caused for so many globally. We have to celebrate today how far we have come. We have preventative drugs available on the NHS, drugs to stop any trace of HIV if you contract it, so you can't pass it on to others. And we're now seeing the major success of opt-out testing in some of the worst hotspots of HIV in the country. And in an odd way, the medical question isn't really the problem, it's the stigma. Recently, I met Harry Whitfield, also known as Charity Case, who last year made his debut on RuPaul's Drag Race UK to showcase his incredible talents, but he also talked about how hard it was dealing with his HIV diagnosis. For World AIDS Day last year, Harry said, quote, "The stigma around HIV is far worse than the disease itself. I take 1 tablet per day to stay healthy and completely undetectable, so I can't pass the disease on. I'm thriving in my life every day, but that's not the narrative that gets told when talking about HIV." Last year, like so many, I was completely engrossed in the series It's a Sin. Until then, it's not something I'd thought that much about. Probably because of my age, I had not properly considered how terrifying that period of time was for so many. So when I got sent a HIV test to raise awareness during testing week, I took the test and posted about it on social media. I knew it had the potential to create some odd feedback, but I felt it was important. Some of the comments included people who thought HIV was a thing of the past and accused me of only talking about it as a means to control people now we're out of the COVID pandemic. It showed me that the importance of keeping this issue alive. I experienced very similar to my honourable friend for Romsey and Southampton North, with people questioning why I thought it was necessary that I took a test and what I'd been up to. However, one constituent thanked me. He said, "I'm a victim of this myself. I was fortunate to be born at the right time for effective treatments, but only just. These new tests were not around when I was diagnosed. I just happened to be randomly finding out through a routine MOT, as they call it." And he also told me that stigma was the main issue. Have to give way.
I thank the Honourable Lady, and indeed I congratulate my honourable friend from Brighton Kemp Town for having secured this important debate on World AIDS Day. Just like her constituency, my Slough constituency also has a relatively high prevalence of HIV, and I think it's vital that our town is properly supported in the fight against HIV and AIDS in order to meet those 2030 targets. And that's why I have also written to the Health Secretary to request that Slough should be included in the scheme for opt-out HIV testing in A&Es. Does she agree with me that it's important that the government supports areas like ours so that we get the right level of support? Because without that, we could be experiencing a resurgence which none of us would want.
I thank the Honourable Member. I completely agree. It's one of the easiest ways that we can end the transmission of HIV and become the first country to be HIV-free by 2030. It would be incredible, and opt-out testing is clearly a great route to do that. The series It's a Sin has helped bring back this issue to life, not just as a reminder of the 38 million globally lost to AIDS-related illness, but also to look back and see how far we've come. It's also made it glaringly obvious we have more to do to tackle the stigma. And at this point, I'd like to place on record my thanks and appreciation for the Terence Higgins Trust. It's been 40 years since the death of Terry Higgins, one of the first to die of an AIDS-related illness. They do incredible work to end the stigma around HIV. It's one of the biggest barriers to stopping people getting tested, and therefore one of the biggest barriers to ending the transmission by 2030. Madam Deputy Speaker, HIV is no longer a death sentence. It's no longer the terrifying disease that It's a Sin so intensely brought to life for people like me that didn't live through those incredibly difficult times. So I end today by also thanking the government for their support in opt-out testing pilots, and call for one last time for this to be extended to other hotspots, including the West Midlands.
Ms Clarkson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Lady from West Bromwich East. I welcome this debate, and I'd thank the Honourable Gentleman from Brighton Kemp Town for bringing it forward today. I'd also like to praise him for his leadership in this area and for the work he's done to educate the public on the realities of people living with HIV. Unfortunately, there are still a lot of prejudices out there, and speaking openly about his own experience as somebody living with HIV, I think is incredibly powerful and important, because when people see their representatives are representative of the society as a whole, it makes a real difference. I won't speak at length because we've had a series of absolutely excellent speeches, and obviously I'm going to use some of the same sort of facts and figures that have been brought up already, but I just wanted to say how pleased I am we are actually still having these debates, because the problem hasn't actually gone away. The government has committed in December 2021 to achieve zero new HIV infections or HIV or AIDS-related deaths by 2030, and that's an ambitious target. I think it's one everybody across this chamber can agree is absolutely essential. The framework for achieving this means ensuring equitable access to the uptake of HIV prevention programmes, scaling up of testing in line with national guidelines, optimising rapid access to treatment and retention in care, improving the quality of life for people living with HIV, and addressing the stigma surrounding infection and testing. We must work to address the lazy stereotypes associated with HIV/AIDS, especially those surrounding the LGBT community. I'm pleased to see that real progress is being made. The government has provided £20 million to ensure that HIV opt-out testing is expanded to areas with high prevalence, including Manchester, London, Blackpool, and I pay tribute to the Honourable Member for Blackpool South as well for his dogged determination in getting Blackpool included, and of course Brighton. And that's helped to reduce diagnosis times and improve diagnosis rates. In Rochdale Borough, where my Hayward and Middleton constituency is located, 2.2 in every 1,000 adults is living with HIV. And I'd particularly like to thank the teams at Middleton Health Centre and Hayward Clinic for their work in providing sexual health and testing support. And I hope we'll be able to take advantage of opt-out testing too. It is essential. The rollout of opt-out saw 128 people newly diagnosed with HIV, 325 people newly diagnosed with Hep C, as has been mentioned, and 153 people diagnosed with Hep C, at a cost of just £2.2 million across 100 days. The opt-out testing actually paid for itself, saving the NHS an estimated £6 to £9 million through early diagnosis and treatment. Opt-out testing also goes some way to addressing health inequalities, with higher proportions of women and people from Black African and Black Caribbean backgrounds being diagnosed compared to the national average. In March 2020, the Department of Health and Social Care provided £16 million in funding to local authorities to provide PrEP, and I warmly welcome that, but barriers still exist. Over 57% of people waited more than 12 weeks to access PrEP, and only 35% of people who attempted to access PrEP were successful. It is essential that that changes. PrEP is a game changer for all of us. Pre-exposure prophylaxis is an essential tool if we are going to end new infections by the next decade in the UK. But of course we know this isn't just a problem at home. The truth is that COVID-19 was the second pandemic of our lifetimes, and we're still living through the first. This is a global matter. That's why I'm proud that the UK provides funds to UN AIDS, the Robert Carr Fund, the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB and malaria, although I will join the Honourable Gentleman in saying that I would have liked to see the level sustained, but I do think the Honourable Member for Tottenham has made an important point that there are other things we can leverage as a country to help other countries in their fight against this disease. The UK is also a co-founder of the Global Fund and the third largest donor historically, so 4.4 billion, as I think was also mentioned by the Honourable Member for Tottenham. And the SEDO announced on the 14th of November that the UK will be contributing a further billion, so at least we're still in the fight. As with COVID, the truth is that none of us are safe until all of us are safe, and we have a role to play in supporting those parts of the world less able to tackle HIV/AIDS than ourselves. As we aim for our 2030 target, I'd also like to draw the government's attention to the recommendations of the Terence Higgins Trust and the National AIDS Trust calling for the expansion of opt-out testing to all areas of high prevalence. I cannot stress how important that is. The provision of PrEP to all who could benefit from it, and again, very, very important, and a refocusing of sexual health services which have been displaced by the recent Mpox outbreak. There's a huge amount of work to do if we are to reach our 2030 target, and that will rely on adequate funding, access and information across society. It will need those of us in this place to speak openly and honestly about HIV/AIDS and be collaborative, working across the piece. I'm confident we can get to that 2030 target, and I will continue to support working towards that endeavour for as long as I have the privilege to be in this place.
SNP spokesperson Steve Bonner.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I also join all members of the House in commending the Honourable Member for Brighton Kempton for leading the debate on the floor of the House for us today, but also for informing us so well on a subject that he is such a powerful crusader and advocate for, and I thank him and commend him for his contributions today. Today, the 1st of December, is annual World AIDS Day. From the inaugural World AIDS Day in 1988, the first ever Global Health Day, until today, has given us an opportunity for people worldwide to unite in the fight against HIV, to show support for people living with HIV, and to commemorate those who have sadly lost their lives in that as a result of AIDS-related illnesses. Over 105,000 people in the UK are currently living with HIV, and globally there are an estimated 38 million people who currently have the virus. Despite only being identified in 1984, more than 35 million people have died of HIV or AIDS-related illnesses, making it one of the most destructive pandemics ever known. Each year in the UK, over 4,000 people are diagnosed with HIV. Many people do not know the facts, Madam Deputy Speaker, about how to protect themselves and others. And the reality is that stigma and discrimination remain a reality for so many people who are currently living with this condition. There are around 6,000 people in Scotland living with AIDS, according to Health Protection Scotland data. And of those attending HIV specialist treatments and care, 98% were receiving ART. And 95% the virus cannot be detected in their blood, meaning they have an undetectable viral load and cannot transmit HIV. We know that many within our society are still largely unaware of the disease and, of course, the risks of it. A survey recently from National AIDS Trust found that only 16% of people surveyed know that if someone with HIV is on effective treatment, that they can't pass HIV on and can expect to live a long, happy, healthy and fulfilling life. HIV does continue to be a major public health crisis, both in the United Kingdom and across the world, as we've heard in the House today. And although we know that HIV disproportionately impacts segments of the LGBTQ+ community, the two issues should not be conflated. HIV is by no means confined to the LGBT+ community or in certain black or ethnic minority communities. The fact is that anyone, regardless of your sexual orientation, your gender, your age or any other factor, can acquire the HIV or AIDS virus. Madam Deputy Speaker, we in Scotland are extremely proud to be the first country in the United Kingdom to make PrEP available free of charge to those at high risk of acquiring HIV. We have made huge progress in detecting and treating HIV, and people with the virus are able to live those long, happy, fulfilling lives that I mentioned. PrEP is free of charge from NHS Scotland for anyone who is more at risk of getting HIV. And we've heard from the Honourable Member for Brighton Kempton, it's simply an oral medicine in pill form comprising of 2 HIV antiretroviral drugs. It's prescribed to HIV negative people at risk of becoming infected as part of a comprehensive approach to HIV prevention. And we know that the drug is highly effective at stopping HIV from being passed on. In clinical trials, PrEP has been shown to reduce the risk of sexually transmitted HIV by between 75 and 86%, hugely successful. And research led by Glasgow's Caledonian University Professor Claudia Escola shows that there has been significant reduction in HIV infections since the implementation of the first PrEP programme in Scotland in July 2017, and that new diagnoses in Scotland have fell by 20%. The SNP Scottish Government will continue to work to reduce the stigma of HIV, to raise awareness of the condition and to reduce its transmission. Support is being provided for new research on reducing transmission of the virus, and a separate working group will also look at the clinical utility of PrEP in Scotland. The SNP Scottish Government have also provided £337,000 to develop a national online service for sexually transmitted infections and bloodborne viruses, which will allow people to request a test online and conduct at-home self-sampling. We've heard across the House today whether that will be successful, but I think any tool that we can possibly to help in our fight against the HIV will be required. These are excellent tools, and the Scottish Government remains committed to being on course to reach the target of eliminating HIV transmission in Scotland and across the rest of the UK by 2030. And as a fierce defender of minorities in this place, I must also mention the plain fact that many of the people living across these nations with HIV are vulnerable individuals, some experiencing language, faith or cultural barriers associated with long-standing stigma, while others will have complexities such as mental health or societal issues that impact their access to health and social care services, leading, of course, to poorer health outcomes. And as we are all too aware, socio-economic inequalities drive health inequalities. So I will ask the Minister to outline the steps being taken by his government to mitigate the impact of austerity and reduce inequality for all our minority communities. The government needs to take an intersectional approach to healthcare, an approach that recognises that many people in the United Kingdom will face multiple and often overlapping disadvantages and barriers to accessing good healthcare, and sometimes we've even heard there's a postcode lottery at place as well. And finally, if I can just turn to the matter of funding, the SNP is once again calling on the UK Government to reverse the in effect 83% cut to UN AIDS funding, and that as a consequence of its decision to cut the AIDS budget from 0.7 to 0.5 of our GDP. And on the 31st of October 2022, the UK government missed the deadline to donate to the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis and malaria. Mike Podmore, the UK director at Stop AIDS, said at the time the UK is acting as an unreliable partner in preventing the Global Fund from communicating clearly to its guarantees about what funding is now available for them to work with, and creating uncertainty. The consequences of that action could be immeasurable in terms of lives affected. Well, the UK did, of course, provide some funding. It was £400 million less than in 2019. So, again, we in the SNP call for the government to do the right thing. The aid budget must be restored to its 0.7 level, particularly so if the UK does not want to be known as an unreliable partner amongst its counterparts. Thank you.
Shadow Minister Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I also want to congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Brighton Kemp Town, for securing this debate, and for the Backbench Business Committee for granting it. And in thanking my honourable friend, the member for Brighton Kemp Town, I want to say that we listened intently to his opening contribution. It was full of wisdom, insight, personal advocacy, and the commitment he brings to this issue in this place. And this House of Commons is a better place for speaking openly and challenging those in power about the issues that still prevail, not just in this country, but across the world when it comes to HIV and AIDS. Now, on this day, we remember the 40 million people who have lost their lives to the worldwide AIDS pandemic and related illnesses since the disease was first found in the 1980s. And in this debate, members from across the House, in a small but perfectly formed manner, have raised some important issues. And I want to particularly thank the Right Honourable Lady, the member for Romsey and Southampton North, for the way that she always challenges inequalities around the world, and particularly inequalities facing women and girls. And of course, this is an issue that affects women and girls across the globe. It is an equalities issue, and I thank her for her contribution. The members for West Bromwich East, Haywood and Middleton, the member for Strangford, indeed even the member for Coatbridge, Christon and Bells Hill, leading for the SNP. The great thing about this issue is it brings us together in unity on World AIDS Day, because this is not a party political issue. Like with COVID, if we are to defeat the first pandemic, we have to work together across party lines. And I think this has been a good debate because of that. We've all recognised the extraordinary work of those who have fought to eradicate the virus. As we've already said, we've come a long way since the first World AIDS Day in 1988, and here in the UK we've seen unprecedented scientific advancement. We understand more about HIV, and we've legislated to better protect those living with HIV against discrimination. We've seen some long overdue justice delivered to victims of the contaminated blood scandal, with interim payments being granted for some, but not all, of those impacted. This victory is a testament to the unstinting work of campaigners and indeed colleagues from both sides of this House. However, and as has been made clear in the Chamber today, there is still much more work that can be done with regards to this injustice. I hope that in his response the Minister will provide an update to the House on when the Government will respond in full to the 19 recommendations laid out by Sir Robert Francis's framework for compensation. Now, this World AIDS Day is not just about recognising how far we've come, something to celebrate. It's also about issuing a call to action. There can be no room for complacency in the late stages of this campaign, because today we stand on the brink of achieving something extraordinary: ending all new HIV transmissions in England by 2030. That goal is ambitious, but it is also achievable, and it's one that Labour is proud to support and to push the government on to achieving. But too many opportunities are still being missed, and sexual health services are struggling to keep up with demand. 46% of people diagnosed with HIV are still diagnosed too late, and 38% of people attending sexual health services were not offered an HIV test last year. That's not good enough. 20% fewer people were tested for HIV in 2021 than in 2019, and research shows that 57% of people have waited more than 12 weeks for PrEP. Shockingly, in 2021, no local authority in England, not one, reported more than 5 women accessing PrEP, and there are still stark racial disparities in treatment and in support which must be addressed. So I would like to use this debate to press the Minister on what steps the government is taking to tackle unequal access to sexual health services, and in particular PrEP. In a recent study, 40% of people surveyed reported difficulty in booking a sexual health appointment online. 23% of people were turned away due to a lack of available appointments. With this in mind, what assessment has the government made of sexual health accessibility levels, and what consideration has the Minister made of making PrEP available beyond sexual health services, for example in GPs, gender clinics, pharmacies and abortion clinics? I would assume that this work would be included in the promised PrEP action plan, but this has yet to materialise. Will the Minister commit to an implementation date for this plan today? And if not, why not? Furthermore, what recent assessment has the Minister made of the eligibility criteria for PrEP, and are there any plans to expand it? Now, PrEP is one side of a coin, and we don't often talk about the other side of the same coin anymore, partly because of the success of PrEP, but that is also access to PEP, post-exposure prophylaxis. The publicity has fallen for that, and but it is still an important tool in the box for people who are fearing that they may have been inadvertently exposed to the HIV virus. There's a small window for those people who fear they've been exposed to HIV or who may have been to get access to PEP for it to be successful. So what is the government doing to ensure that there is also adequate advice and information on the availability of post-exposure prophylaxis? Now, we also know that sexual health services are under unprecedented pressure due to MPOX. Service displacement means that appointments for PrEP, STI testing and long-active reversible contraceptives have been cut. This has also led to reported hesitancy by clinics to deliver MPOX vaccines. What action will the Minister be taking to ensure that all those who need the MPOX vaccine can access one, and not to the detriment of other vital sexual health services? Now, moving on to testing, the Minister will no doubt be aware that yesterday NHS England released their report on HIV and hepatitis opt-out testing in areas of very high prevalence. This is something that Labour has been proud to support for several years, and the report shows that because of these tests, more than 800 people living with undiagnosed HIV and hepatitis have been identified in these areas, and we have saved an estimated £6 to £8 million in treatment costs. Put simply, opt-out testing has been a huge success. With that in mind, can the Minister set out whether there are any plans to change the current scope of HIV opt-out testing to include all areas of high prevalence? And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to touch on stigma. A study recently published by the Terence Higgins Trust found that just 38% of people knew that those living with HIV and on effective treatment cannot pass the virus on to partners. Only 30% of people said they would be comfortable dating somebody with HIV. The HIV epidemic is exacerbated by this stigma, by ignorance and by misinformation. If we want equitable access to HIV treatment, then we must proactively tackle the myths and the bigotry which still permeate discussions around HIV. Now, I'm sure the Minister will agree wholeheartedly with me on this, and I would be interested to hear his assessment of current legislative barriers affecting those living with HIV. A clear example of this is the fact that LGBT plus people with HIV are still not allowed to access fertility treatment, despite the fact that heterosexual people with HIV are able to do so. This is an out-of-date barrier and it needs scrapping. And I'm proud that the next Labour government will equalise access to fertility treatment for LGBT plus living with HIV. Will the Minister join us in committing to this and pledge to introduce legislation now, before the general election, to end these restrictions which prevent people with HIV from starting a family? To conclude, Madam Deputy Speaker, Labour is committed to the HIV 2030 pledge, and it is more than prepared to work on a cross-party basis to make this ambition a reality. But we must address some incredibly concerning trends in HIV treatment and access and not become complacent because of the progress that has come before us. No new transmissions of HIV by 2030 is still possible. We want to succeed, but there is no time to waste. As my honourable friend, the member for Brighton Kemp Town said, let's all together sprint to that finish line.
Minister Neil O'Brien.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And let me start by congratulating all the members from across all sides of the House who have taken part in what I think has been an incredibly informative and high-quality debate. And let me join others in congratulating the Honourable Member for Brighton Kemp Town in a speech which mixed huge personal experience and knowledge, years of advocacy and successful campaigning, and also huge number of insights and numerous things that the Honourable Member asked about. I will undertake to look at, to pick on just a few from his speech. He asked about the bureaucratic barriers stopping syphilis testing from being added to the opt-out testing, which we're already doing for HIV, Hep B and Hep C. He talked about some of the risks around the shift to online clinics, the point about people on PrEP being tested regularly, the experiment, the very promising experiment by the Terence Higgins Trust about saliva testing for HIV, and also a number of the other points that he raised, including the important issue about patent waivers as well. So there's a huge amount in his speech for us to take away and look at. And the same is true of other honourable members, Madam Deputy Speaker. And the honourable member for my honourable friend for Romsey and Southampton North made hugely important points about women and girls. There's incredibly striking and harrowing statistics and important points about the barriers to testing, particularly among minority groups, where we can learn from the way we are tackling that problem in other fields as well, including the COVID and vaccination work. The honourable member for Strangford gave us insights from what is happening in Northern Ireland, the role of the Public Health Agency there and what they're doing on PrEP, the role of the Church in his constituency and the connections between Swaziland and Strangford, which might surprise outsiders, and the work of the Positive Life charity in Northern Ireland, which I would also commend. My honourable friend from West Bromwich East talked about the experiences of stigma very powerfully of her own constituents, and she made the important point that there's a high prevalence area that it should be considered for the expansion of opt-out testings, and similar points were made by the honourable members for Slough and for Hayward and Middleton. I join my honourable friend from Hayward and Middleton in commending the work of Middleton Health Centre. And of course, the honourable member for Coatsbridge, Crowston, Bells Hill also talked about some important lessons we can learn, and I'm always keen to learn from across the UK about the rollout of PrEP in Scotland. And to respond to one of the many questions raised by the opposition frontbench right at the top of this debate, just about the impact of the rollout of our world-leading vaccination campaign against Mpox, we are absolutely talking to those relatively small number of clinics which have had to deliver the huge majority of that campaign to save people from Mpox, and about their financial impact and the impact on their day-to-day work. That is something we are actively doing. Madam Deputy Speaker, World AIDS Day is an invitation to underline our commitment to tackling HIV, to show our support for people living with HIV, and to remember those we have lost to AIDS. And I'm proud of how far we have come from the stigma and the sidelining of the past, which a number of members have mentioned today, to where we are today, thanks to the collaborative efforts and commitment of the government, together with HIV patients, their friends and family, campaigners, medics, researchers and the health and care system at all levels. Today, when diagnosed early and with access to antiretroviral therapy, most people living with HIV in England can expect a near normal life expectancy, and people diagnosed with HIV can expect to receive HIV care that is world-class, free and open access. And this has been the result of our collective and collaborative partnerships. However, we know that despite successes, HIV has not gone away, and there is still much more that we should do. And that is why, Madam Deputy Speaker, last year this government published its commitment to end new HIV transmissions in England by 2030 through the HIV Action Plan. And that plan is the cornerstone of our approach in England to drive forward progress and achieve our bold ambitions. And we've come far in the first year since its publication. The UK met the UNAIDS 95-95-95 targets for the first time in 2020. 95% of HIV-positive individuals are diagnosed, 99% of those diagnosed were receiving treatment, and 97% of those receiving treatment were being virally suppressed. And I'm pleased to see the number of people being newly diagnosed with HIV in England continues to fall. The latest data on HIV diagnosis shows that 2,955 people were diagnosed with HIV in England in 2021, a 33% decline compared with 2019, when the government first made its commitment to end new HIV transmissions in England by 2030. We are, of course, conscious of the need to avoid flatlining or slowing of the pace in any way. We are, at the moment, still understanding the impact of the COVID pandemic and the things that have happened during that period, but there has been progress. And those successes have been underpinned by clear national leadership and strengthened partnership working. And I'm very grateful to Professor Kevin Fenton, the government's chief advisor on HIV, who has been chairing the HIV Action Plan Implementation Steering Group, involving the key partners involved in the delivery of the HIV Action Plan, including local government, the NHS, and our voluntary and community sector. And the steering group has met quarterly throughout this year to monitor progress on our commitments and ensure appropriate action was taken to keep moving forward with our objectives. And within that, the remit of that group, they have established task and finish groups focusing on the key priorities for action, such as improving equity and access to HIV drug prevention PrEP and addressing workforce challenges, amongst others. We're also very thankful for the work of the UK Health Security Agency, which excels as a world-class leader running high-quality data collection and surveillance systems to help us better understand and address the challenges on HIV. And those have enabled us to truly understand developments, emerging issues, and where we can have greatest impact with our prevention efforts, and to add to our growing repertoire of world-leading British innovation systems and technology. And of course, none of that would have been possible without the brilliant efforts of our local government, NHS, and voluntary community sector partners to deliver the highest quality healthcare tailored to the needs of their local populations. We know through their work that different areas face very different challenges, and we remain committed to helping level up outcomes for the whole population across the country. And so a key priority, therefore, of the government's approach is to ensure that all underserved populations benefit equally from improvements made in HIV outcomes. And there's been a range of important suggestions made during this debate about how to go further. This includes scaling up our prevention efforts and increasing access to prevention PrEP. We've already invested 33 million to roll out PrEP access across sexual health services over the past 2 years, and PrEP is now being commissioned as a routine service through the public health grant. And delivering against these commitments, UCSA has now developed and published a monitoring evaluation framework to support local authorities, sexual health services and other key stakeholders to inform continuous service development in PrEP commissioning and delivery using the existing data that's available. And I'm sure that many of the people involved in the delivery of their service will have followed this debate today with great interest and noted some of the challenges put by different honourable members. Happy to give way, yeah.
One of the problems is that the department does not collate data on the average wait times for sexual health clinics and the availability of slots for PrEP appointments in sexual health clinics. Without that data, we rely on these voluntary organisations doing freedom of information requests and reports periodically. Getting a baseline set from the department would make a big difference for us to be able to then understand areas that are struggling to roll out PrEP versus areas that maybe are not. Is that something that he could take back to the department to look at how, and I understand why in the past we've been nervous about publishing data on sexual health issues, but I think now is the time that we can be a bit more open about that and maybe publish some of those pieces of data or collate them, if not already, to be able to then start to target our action.
Madam Deputy Speaker, that is certainly something that I will take away and look at. As the Honourable Member points out, there are a number of challenges and about doing that and unpicking the activities on different diseases of sexual health services and some of the risks that he already alluded to, but I will certainly go away and undertake to look at that important point. We know that there's more to do to improve PrEP access for key groups, and we are in the process of developing a plan for provision of PrEP in settings beyond sexual and reproductive health services to help reach those who are underrepresented. And that is a point and something that a number of members have called for during this debate. Our efforts are also focused on scaling and improving testing levels in targeted high-risk populations, including in Black African communities, to be able to reach those 4,500 individuals who we believe are living with HIV but unaware of their status. And as part of the implementation of the action plan, NHS England is investing 20 million over the next 3 years to expand HIV opt-out testing in A&E departments in the local authority areas across the country with the highest prevalence of HIV and across the whole of London. As a number of honourable members have pointed out, this is a proven effective way now to identify new HIV cases. It promotes testing on admission to hospital of anyone who's not previously been diagnosed with HIV, therefore rapidly helping to identify the virus. And 33 A&E departments are now live, delivering this important initiative. While doing that, we took the opportunity to link the initiative to the Hepatitis C elimination programme, backed by a further 6.85 million to provide Hepatitis B and C testing as well. And as a number of honourable members have alluded to, NHS England have published the first 100 days report just yesterday, which describes the progress, the challenges, the results and the learning from that first period of the initiative. And those very early findings show the benefits of the approach. More than 200,000 HIV tests conducted over the first 100 days alone of opt-out testing across London, Manchester, Salford, Blackpool and Brighton, which meant that over 600 people have been identified with a previously unknown blood-borne virus. Of those, 128 people were newly identified as living with HIV, and 65 people living with HIV who were previously diagnosed but were not under the care of an HIV clinic were also identified. This approach is very important to ensure that everyone living with HIV can access testing and rapid linkage to treatment and care, allowing them to live a long and healthy life. Moreover, 325 people have been identified newly with hepatitis B, and 153 people have been newly identified with chronic HCV. A further 50 were found who had been disengaged from care for both diseases, and 7 people who were identified but had previously cleared the hepatitis C virus. And we will be considering evidence from the first initial evidence of testing alongside the data on progress towards our ambitions to decide how and whether we further expand this programme. I absolutely hear the call from members across the House to do so. We are in the very early days of evidence on this. I have to say that evidence is extremely encouraging, and I absolutely hear what honourable members across the House are saying, given the success of that programme in its first 100 days. But of course we need to have the evidence as it develops a bit further. We are redoubling our efforts to increase HIV testing in other ways too, through the whole country during National HIV Testing Week, which took place in February this year. And the results are very promising. 30% of the almost 25,000 users who ordered an HIV and syphilis self-sampling kit during the campaign had never tested before, and a majority of the campaign's target audiences reporting having taken some kind of preventative action as a result of that campaign. We know there's still a lot more we need to do to achieve our ambitions. The HIV Action Plan Monitoring Evaluation Framework developed by UCSA, which has been published today, will explore in detail the inequalities and the gaps in HIV provision, testing and care, and other indicators of progress required to achieve our shared ambitions. And those actions continue to be very closely monitored by the HIV Action Plan Implementation Steering Group, including key delivery partners like local government, the NHS, and the voluntary and community sector, to ensure that we remain on track to meet the 2025 and 2030 objectives, and that my Secretary of State will report annually to Parliament on progress towards our objectives. World AIDS Day gives us the chance to reflect on progress and challenges, being accountable for what we've done over the last year and where we need to continue improving. But most importantly, it gives us the possibility of coming together to reinstate our collective commitment to continue working together to end new HIV transmissions in England by 2030 and to finish the race.
Lloyd Russell Moyle to wind up.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you everyone that has spoken today, right honourable members for Romsey South North, Strangford, West Bromwich East, and Hayward and Middleton, as well as the front bench contributions. I think all of the speeches and the interventions as well that have happened have been very good. I'm pleased that the Minister has talked about the continued rollout of opt-out testing. My feeling is that when results come back that are so good, there is sometimes an argument to start making moves now. I'm not saying that it should be rolled out tomorrow in all those hospitals, but we know that the lead-in time takes a number of months to make sure clinicians and everyone are coordinated. And so messages from the Department of Health now saying we will be rolling this out next year when the final results come back unless something happens would enable a smooth rollout. So some of those things I think we can go a bit further on. But I am pleased that the Minister mentioned those things. And I am pleased also that he will work to ensure that there is better outreach for PrEP in community settings. Those community settings shouldn't just be for hard-to-reach groups, but they will be particularly helpful for those groups, pharmacists and doctors particularly. So I'm delighted about that. So I'd like to say thank you to also my local organisations, and I'll finish here because it's always nice to mention the local organisations. The Lawson Unit, which continue to support my care and the care of everyone with HIV in Brighton, Peer Action, the Martin Fisher Foundation, which is named after one of the HIV consultants that passed away in Brighton and works on stigma. We have 2 stigma buses that drive around Brighton with the stats about U=U plastered on the outside of the buses. We send those buses up to Tunbridge Wells every day and they come back again, so even the rural areas of Sussex get to see our messages. Of course, Fast Track Cities, which the Minister mentioned, Lunch Positive, the Sussex Beacon, which is one of only 2 residential care centres for people with HIV and AIDS in Britain, Mind Out, the Terence Higgins Trust, and of course Frontline AIDS, one of the global leading HIV development organisations based in Brighton and Hove, and all of them will be there at the memorial 6 o'clock tonight, and I'm sure hopefully many of our community. Thank you again for everyone. Cheers.
The question is as on the order paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.